My name is Ben, and I'm 26 years old. For as long as I can remember, my life has been a mix of hard work and, well, hard knocks. I grew up with my dad, Frank, a man who seemed to take pleasure in making my life difficult. I can't count the number of times he looked at me with that same disappointed expression, as if I were some burden he just couldn't shake. I always wondered what I'd done to deserve his constant scorn. It was as if I couldn't do anything right in his eyes. No matter how hard I worked or how much I tried, he'd always find some flaw to point out. "You'll never be more than this, Ben," he'd say, almost with a smirk. I got used to hearing those words, but they never hurt any less. Despite the way Frank treated me, I refused to give up on myself. I worked hard, pushing through the bitterness that filled my childhood home. I focused on my job, taking every opportunity to prove my worth to the world outside. I met people who respected me, and I even landed a position in a decent company, which felt like my ticket to a life beyond Frank's reach. That's also where I met Emma, my supervisor. She was sharp, determined, and everything I admired. For the first time, I felt seen for who I was, not for who people expected me to be. Emma had a way of making me feel like I mattered, like I had something valuable to offer. Maybe that's why I couldn't help falling for her. We hadn't really talked about it yet, but there was definitely something there. Still, no matter how far I tried to go, the weight of Frank's disapproval followed me like a shadow. And as much as I tried to shake it off, it stayed with me, gnawing at my confidence. I couldn't help but wonder if maybe, deep down, he was right. Maybe I really was just ordinary. But all that changed one rainy afternoon when I found out the truth. Something that would flip my entire world upside down and turn the life I thought I knew into something else entirely. I was at the hospital visiting an elderly family friend, Henry, who had been close to Frank when they were younger. He was a sweet old man with a sharp memory, and he liked to reminisce about the good old days. I listened to his stories as a way to escape my own reality for a little while. That day, though, something about his stories seemed different. He looked at me with an intensity one hadn't seen before, as if he was weighing something in his mind. "Ben," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you. It's about your father." Those words sent a chill down my spine. He paused, taking a shaky breath, and then he said something that changed everything. "You're not really Frank's son," he said, his eyes searching mine. "You're the son of his brother, Charles." At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was just his memory playing tricks on him. But the look on his face told me he was serious. "Your dad, Frank, he swapped you with his own son, Oliver, when you were both born. Charles was supposed to take you home, but Frank, he wanted revenge. He thought he'd been wronged, so he made sure his son, Oliver, would grow up with Charles's wealth, while you'd be left here with him." I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. My whole life, my identity, had been a lie. I had been raised by a man who wasn't even my father, a man who'd taken me in just to watch me struggle. Henry continued, his words slow and careful. "Charles doesn't know. He never did. And as far as he knows, Oliver is his real son." I left the hospital in a daze, the rain pouring down as I stumbled through the streets. It felt as if the world had been pulled out from under me, and I didn't know which way was up anymore. The shock of what I just learned echoed through my mind like a haunting melody I couldn't silence. I replayed Henry's words again and again, each time feeling the sting of betrayal sink deeper. I'd spent my whole life trying to win Frank's approval, trying to prove I was worth something to a man who never cared, who never intended for me to succeed. And the worst part? My real father, Charles, had no idea I even existed as his son. He had been living a life with another person, Frank's son, Oliver, believing him to be his own flesh and blood. As I walked back home, drenched from the rain, a new determination began to stir in me. I had to meet Charles. I had to know the truth, and maybe, just maybe, there was a chance he would believe me. I wanted answers, and even more, I wanted a connection. I didn't know what would come of it, but I was done living in the shadows of lies. The next day, I made my way to the company Charles owned, a large financial firm where Oliver worked, no doubt set up to inherit everything. Walking into the towering building felt surreal, like I was stepping into a life that could have been mine. My hands were sweaty, my heart racing with every step toward the reception desk. I wasn't sure how I would introduce myself or explain why I was there, but I knew this was a moment I couldn't avoid. When I asked to speak with Charles, the receptionist eyed me with suspicion but eventually called up to his office. After what felt like an eternity, she motioned me toward a waiting area, where I sat, rehearsing what I might say, praying he'd give me a chance to speak. After about 20 minutes, the doors opened, and a tall man with a composed, dignified presence walked toward me. Charles, my real father. He wore a warm, professional smile, but there was an intensity in his gaze that reminded me of someone who'd seen both success and hardship. Ben, is it? He asked, his voice calm yet curious. I nodded, feeling my mouth go dry. Yes, thank you for meeting with me. I know you're busy. What brings you here? He asked, his voice steady as he studied me with a look that was both polite and cautious. I took a deep breath, deciding there was no way to approach this but head-on. I know this is going to sound unbelievable, but I believe I'm your son. You and Frank's son, Oliver, were switched at birth. He blinked, the practiced calm on his face faltering for just a moment. Switched at birth. His voice was almost a whisper, as if he was grappling with the sheer absurdity of my words. Yes, I continued, holding his gaze. Frank raised me, but he did it as revenge against you. He wanted his son, Oliver, to grow up in your world, with all the opportunities and advantages you could give. And I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. I was left with him, believing he was my father, trying to earn his approval for years without ever knowing the truth. He sat down beside me, his face drained of color. I could see a storm of emotions in his eyes: shock, disbelief, anger, and a hint of pain. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. Ben, this is a lot to take in, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you have any proof of this? I shook my head, feeling the weight of the words. I don't have much, but an old family friend, Henry, told me everything. He was there the day it happened, and he remembered it all. How Frank arranged everything to take me and leave Oliver with you. Charles rubbed his temples, clearly struggling to process this. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. I'll need time to confirm this, if what you're saying is true. If Frank really did that, he paused, his fists clenching. Then he's stolen more than just a life from me. He's stolen my son. In that moment, something shifted. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal as he grappled with the possibility that the boy he'd raised might not be his son, and that the young man before him, me, could be. Finally, he met my gaze, his expression softening. Ben, if this is true, I don't know how to make up for the years we've lost, but I want to get to the bottom of this. I'll do everything I can to uncover the truth. Relief flooded through me. For the first time, I felt like someone was standing by my side, willing to fight for me. Charles and I agreed to arrange a DNA test, something concrete to confirm everything. As we said goodbye, he placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. No matter what happens, Ben, you're not alone in this. If what you say is true, then you're my son, and I'll be here to make things right. I left his office with a glimmer of hope. For the first time, I felt like I was finally on the path toward the truth, toward a future where I didn't have to live under Frank's shadow. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find a family who wanted me as much as I wanted them. The days leading up to the DNA test were some of the longest of my life. Every hour dragged by with a mix of hope and dread, leaving me wondering what would come of it all. I was trying to stay positive, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. What if this was some horrible mistake? What if Charles found out I wasn't really his son after all? But at the same time, I knew in my gut that it was true. Henry's story had filled in too many blanks, explained too many questions that had haunted me for years. I was ready to know once and for all, even if the answer was painful. Finally, the day of the test arrived. I met Charles at the clinic, my heart pounding as I walked in and saw him waiting in the lobby. He looked as tense as I felt, his normally composed demeanor replaced with something raw and vulnerable. He gave me a nod, a silent acknowledgement of what this moment meant for both of us. The test itself was simple, a quick cheek swab, a few forms to sign, and then all we could do was wait. As we left the clinic, Charles suggested we grab a coffee nearby to pass the time, and I was grateful for the chance to talk without the weight of waiting for results hanging over us. As we sat down with our drinks, an awkward silence stretched between us. I didn't know what to say, and I could tell he was struggling too. This was uncharted territory for both of us. Finally, he cleared his throat. "So, Ben, tell me about yourself. What was it like growing up?" I hesitated, not sure how much he wanted to hear. But then I thought about all the years I'd spent keeping everything to myself, hiding the bruises, physical and emotional, that life with Frank had left behind. It wasn't easy, I admitted, looking down at my coffee. Frank was, well, he wasn't exactly the supportive type. I spent most of my life trying to prove myself to him, hoping he'd finally see some value in me. But it never seemed to matter what I did. I always fell short in his eyes. Charles's face tightened, a flash of anger in his eyes. "I can't believe he'd do that to you, if what you're saying is true. Then Frank not only took you from me but made your life miserable just to get back at me." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I think that was his plan all along. I didn't know until recently, but he's been holding on to some kind of grudge against you. He wanted Oliver to live the life I should have had, and he made sure I felt every bit of his resentment." Charles shook his head, a mix of sadness and anger in his expression. "If only I had known. If only there had been some way to see through it. I trusted him. I trusted my own brother with the most precious part of my life, my son, and he turned it into some twisted game of revenge." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of what Frank had done settling between us. I could see the pain in Charles's eyes, and it hurt to know that I'd been a stranger to him all these years. After a few moments, he spoke up again, his voice softer. "I want you to know, Ben, that if this test confirms what you've told me, you'll have a place here. I don't know how to make up for the years we lost, but I want to try." A flicker of hope stirred within me. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thank you, Charles. I'd like that." We left the coffee shop with a newfound sense of connection, tentative but real. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking more and more about what life might look like if the test confirmed what I already felt in my heart. For the first time, I imagined a future that didn't involve Frank's constant criticism or the loneliness of feeling like an outsider in my own family. Finally, the day came. The clinic had called Charles to let him know that the results were ready, and he asked me to meet him at his office to open them together. I walked into his office with my heart racing, every nerve in my body on edge. Charles sat at his desk, holding the sealed envelope in his hands. He looked at me, his face a mixture of anticipation and fear. "Are you ready?" I nodded, feeling like the floor could drop out from under me at any moment. He took a deep breath, then carefully opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the document, and as he read, a look of relief washed over his face. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a kind of joy I'd never seen before. "It's true," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Ben, you're my son." The words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt an overwhelming rush of emotion, relief, joy, and a deep sense of belonging that I'd never known before. I was his son. After years of feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, I finally had a family, a real family. Charles stood up and walked over to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Ben. I'm sorry for everything you've been through. But from now on, you're where you belong." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Instead, I wrapped him in a hug, feeling a warmth and acceptance I'd craved my whole life. For the first time, I felt like I was truly home. But as we stood there, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Frank and Oliver wouldn't accept this easily, and I had a feeling they would come back, fighting to hold on to the life that wasn't theirs. There was still a storm on the horizon, but for now, I allowed myself a moment of peace, knowing that I finally had my place in the world. And whatever came next, I wasn't going to face it alone. In the days after we got the DNA results, I started to feel like a new person. Charles and I spent more time together, getting to know each other in ways we'd never had the chance to before. He showed me around the family business, introducing me to people as his son, Ben. Hearing those words filled me with a sense of pride I'd never experienced. For the first time, I felt like I was seen and valued for who I truly was. Charles, on his part, seemed determined to make up for the lost years. He invited me to dinners, shared stories about his life, and listened as I told him about my struggles with Frank. He reassured me time and time again that I belonged in his world. Despite the overwhelming joy, there was a part of me that remained on edge, unable to shake the feeling that the peace we'd found wouldn't last long. My instincts weren't wrong. Just as I was beginning to feel settled, Frank and Oliver resurfaced, stirring up trouble. It started subtly. Rumors in town, people whispering behind my back, questioning my place in Charles's life and the legitimacy of my claim. I could sense Oliver's bitterness and desperation lurking behind every rumor, every sideways glance. One evening, Charles and I were having dinner when his phone buzzed. He picked it up, frowning as he read a message, then put it down, looking tense. "What's wrong?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "It's Oliver," he replied, his tone grim. "He's filed a lawsuit. He's challenging the DNA results, claiming they were faked. He's accusing us of manipulating everything to push him out of his rightful place." The news hit me like a punch to the gut. I had expected some resistance, but a lawsuit? It was a bold move even for Oliver. "Is there any chance he could succeed?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Charles shook his head, though his expression was troubled. "No, the results are legitimate and we have proof. But the lawsuit will drag this through the courts and the media. It won't be easy. Oliver is trying to tarnish our reputation, hoping that he can pressure us into giving up." I nodded, feeling a wave of anger rise within me. This was classic Frank and Oliver, pulling every dirty trick to keep control. But this time I wasn't going to back down. "Let's fight it," I said firmly. "I'm done letting them take what isn't theirs. I'll stand by your side through this, no matter what they throw our way." Charles smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "I knew I could count on you, Ben. We'll face this together." And so the battle began. Over the following weeks, we met with lawyers, gathered our evidence, and prepared for the court hearings. Meanwhile, Oliver took every opportunity to stir up trouble. He painted himself as the victim, claiming he'd been blindsided and betrayed, and even going as far as accusing Charles of lying about the DNA test results. The media caught on to the story, and soon we were dealing with reporters outside the office, questions flying, people looking at us with suspicion. I did my best to ignore it, focusing on what mattered, proving that I was the rightful son, and putting an end to the years of lies and deceit. The court hearings were intense, each side presenting its case. Oliver's lawyers argued that he was the true son, that our story of being switched at birth was a fabrication meant to push him out of his inheritance. But our side was prepared, presenting the DNA test results, testimonies from the hospital staff, and even Henry's statement, all proving the truth. One day during the hearing, as I left the courtroom for a break, I saw Frank standing in the hallway. He looked older, angrier, his face lined with bitterness. When he saw me, he smirked, that same cold expression I remembered from my childhood. "You think you've won, don't you?" he sneered, stepping closer. "You think that just because Charles believes your little story, you've somehow taken my son's place. But let me tell you something, Ben. This isn't over." I held his gaze, my own anger simmering beneath the surface. "No, Frank, it is over. For years, you made my life miserable, all to satisfy your own jealousy. But that ends now. You stole my family, my life, and now you'll finally face the consequences." He laughed, the sound cold and empty. "Consequences? You have no idea what real consequences are, Ben. I built Oliver's life with everything I had, and I won't let you waltz in here and take it away." But his words didn't faze me anymore. I was done fearing him. "This isn't about taking anything, Frank. It's about the truth. And no matter what you do, you can't change that." With one last bitter glare, Frank turned and walked away, but I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time, I'd stood up to him without fear, without doubt. I was ready to reclaim my life, no matter what he tried to throw in my path. When the day of the final ruling came, I sat beside Charles in the courtroom, bracing myself for whatever decision the judge would make. Oliver looked smug, confident, as if he believed he could somehow twist the truth in his favor. Frank sat beside him, his expression cold, eyes fixed straight ahead. The judge reviewed the evidence one last time, the DNA results, the hospital records, and the testimonies from those who knew about the switch. Finally, he turned to us, his face calm but resolute. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, it is clear that Ben is indeed the biological son of Charles, while Oliver is the son of Frank. The court upholds the validity of the DNA results and recognizes Ben as the rightful heir. A wave of relief washed over me, and I heard Charles let out a breath beside me, his hand gripping my shoulder. Oliver's face twisted with fury, his confidence shattering in an instant. Frank's expression remained cold, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps the realization that he'd lost. As we left the courtroom, I felt a sense of closure settling over me. The truth had finally been recognized, and I could begin a new chapter, free from the lies that had weighed me down for so long. Charles and I walked out together, side by side, ready to build the life we both deserved. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us, but I felt calm, steady. I held my head high, answering their questions without fear or hesitation. This was my story, and I was finally ready to live it, without the shadow of Frank and Oliver hanging over me. And as I looked at Charles, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as father and son. The days after the court ruling felt like a new beginning. For the first time in my life, I felt the freedom of being accepted, embraced, and protected by a real family. Charles welcomed me into his world with open arms, encouraging me to get involved in the family business and even offering to show me the ropes. I was finally part of something greater, something that had always seemed out of reach. But even as Charles and I began to build a new life together, the past still lingered, refusing to fade entirely. Despite the court's decision, Oliver and Frank hadn't given up. Oliver continued to spread lies and rumors, desperate to hold onto some shred of influence and sympathy. He went to the media, painting himself as the wronged son, and spun his story to make it look as though he'd been betrayed. He knew he couldn't change the legal ruling, but he could still try to tarnish our reputation. One evening, Charles and I were sitting in his office, discussing plans for expanding the business. He'd been showing me the different divisions, encouraging me to find the areas I was most passionate about. We were in the middle of discussing some new investments when his assistant, Laura, knocked and entered the room with a concerned look. "Mr. Simmons, I think you should see this," she said, handing him a tablet. Charles's face darkened as he scanned the screen, his eyes narrowing with anger. I leaned over to look, and there it was, an article plastered across the internet, with Oliver's name and photo front and center. The headline read, "Betrayed Son Fights to Reclaim His Family Legacy." The article was full of lies, a carefully crafted story that twisted the facts and painted Charles and me as the villains. Oliver claimed that I had tricked my way into the family, using fabricated DNA results, and that I was manipulating Charles for his wealth. He played the part of the innocent son, abandoned by a father he loved, robbed of his rightful place. Charles clenched his fists, his jaw tight with anger. "I can't believe he stooped to this. Even after everything, he's still trying to tear us down." I felt a surge of anger too, but more than that, I felt sad. Sad for the years of lies and bitterness that Frank had instilled in Oliver, and for the life Oliver could have had if he'd chosen a different path. But I knew better than to let that sadness hold me back. I'd come too far to let Oliver and Frank drag me down again. "What should we do?" I asked Charles, trying to keep my voice steady. He took a deep breath, his expression softening as he looked at me. "We stay true to ourselves, Ben. We've fought hard for the truth, and no amount of lies can change that. But I think it's time we made a statement of our own." The next day, Charles arranged a press conference. He wanted to set the record straight, to make sure the public knew the real story behind the twisted lies Oliver was spreading. I was nervous, but Charles encouraged me to stand by his side. This was our story, and we were going to tell it together. When we arrived at the conference, reporters and cameras were everywhere. Their eyes trained on us as we approached the podium. Charles stepped up first, his voice calm and steady. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "I'm here today with my son, Ben, to address the false claims that have been circulating. This is not just about defending ourselves. It's about standing by the truth." He paused, glancing at me with a reassuring nod before continuing. "My brother, Frank, made choices years ago that have caused harm to both of our families. Ben is my biological son, a fact that has been confirmed by the court, but beyond that, he is a man of integrity, strength, and loyalty. He is my son in every way that matters." I felt a surge of pride hearing those words, and I stepped forward, speaking into the microphone for the first time. I understand that this story might seem strange, even hard to believe. For years, I lived in confusion, unaware of the truth. But I know who I am now. I am Ben Simmons, Charles's son, and I am proud to stand here with him today. The room was silent as the reporters took in our words. The questions started pouring in, and we answered each one with honesty, refusing to be dragged into Oliver's game of deception. We spoke about the years of struggle, the painful truth about my upbringing, and the steps we'd taken to finally uncover the reality of who I was. By the end of the conference, I felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. In the days that followed, the media's perspective shifted. The truth had finally cut through the lies, and the public began to see Oliver's story for what it was: a desperate attempt to hold onto a life that was never truly his. With the support of Charles, the family business, and the strength of our own voices, we reclaimed our narrative, refusing to let Frank and Oliver control our lives any longer. One evening, as Charles and I shared dinner, he raised a glass, a proud smile on his face. "To new beginnings, Ben. You've fought harder than anyone should ever have to, and I couldn't be prouder of you." I raised my own glass, meeting his gaze. "To family, and to finally finding a place to call home." In that moment, I felt a peace settle within me. The journey had been painful and difficult, but it had led me here, to a family that loved me and a future that was finally mine to shape. Weeks passed, and life finally began to feel settled. Charles and I worked side by side, building not only the family business but also our bond as father and son. There was a rhythm to our days, a sense of purpose that had been missing in my life for so long. The shadows of the past felt distant, and for the first time, I was genuinely looking forward to the future. But as I had come to learn, some things weren't so easy to shake off. Frank and Oliver may have retreated from the public eye, but they hadn't truly gone away. They lurked in the background, fueled by resentment and bitterness, waiting for an opportunity to strike. And that opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, as Charles and I were finishing up at the office, his assistant Laura entered the room with a worried look on her face. "Mr. Simmons, I just received word that there's been an attempt to access company accounts from an unknown source. It seems like someone's trying to breach the system." Charles's face tightened, his usually calm expression turning serious. "Did they manage to get through?" "No," she replied. "Our security protocols blocked them, but they got close. I've alerted the IT team and they're investigating. But, sir, the location of the attempted access, it's linked to a personal account belonging to Frank." Hearing his name sent a chill down my spine. I looked at Charles, whose expression was now one of grim realization. "Frank's not done," he said, a hint of sorrow in his voice. "He's still trying to sabotage us. Even after everything," I felt a surge of anger mixed with frustration. Frank had already taken so much from us, and yet he couldn't leave us alone. But I could see that, while this frustrated Charles, he was also deeply saddened. No matter what Frank had done, he was still his brother, someone he had once trusted and cared for. "We can't let him get away with this," I said firmly, determined to protect the life we'd built. "I'll work with the IT team, and we'll make sure every single account and system is locked down." Frank won't have a chance to harm us again. Charles nodded, his face softening as he looked at me. Thank you, Ben. I know this isn't easy for you either, but we'll face this together, just like we've faced everything else. Over the next few days, we tightened our security measures, ensuring that every account, every system was secure. Charles and I both kept a close eye on things, and it seemed like Frank's attempts to interfere had been thwarted. I thought that maybe, just maybe, he would finally back off and accept the truth. But Frank had other plans. One morning, I arrived at the office to find Charles waiting for me, a newspaper in his hand. His face was drawn, his eyes filled with anger and disbelief. He handed me the paper, and my heart sank as I read the headline. Family Betrayal. Insider accuses Simmons Enterprises of fraud and corruption. The article was filled with outrageous claims, all allegedly from an anonymous family member. It painted Charles as a corrupt businessman who had used illegal tactics to gain wealth and accused me of being an accomplice in covering up his supposed misdeeds. I knew immediately that this was Frank's doing, his last, desperate attempt to destroy our reputation. Charles let out a sigh, his shoulders slumping. He's really trying to tear us down, Ben. I don't know how much more I can take. I put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We'll get through this, Dad. He's grasping at straws, and people will see that. We've been transparent and honest in everything we've done. The truth will prevail. But despite my confidence, I knew we had a battle ahead of us. Frank's accusations were serious, and he'd chosen to leak them to the press, knowing the damage that public perception could cause. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with lawyers, PR teams, and company executives, all working to clear our name and counter the lies Frank had spread. We held press conferences, issued statements, and provided evidence of our integrity. But the damage had been done. Investors were nervous, employees were anxious, and the media continued to fuel the fire. I could see the toll it was taking on Charles. He was exhausted, worn down by the constant attacks from his own brother. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Charles and I sat in his office, both of us silent, lost in our own thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but filled with conviction. Ben, I never wanted any of this for you. You deserve a life free from all this bitterness. I don't want Frank to ruin everything we've built. I shook my head. No, Dad. This is my life too, and I'm not letting Frank take it from us. I'm in this fight with you. We'll weather this storm together. A faint smile appeared on his face. Thank you, Ben. I'm grateful to have you by my side. The next day, we received an unexpected call from Frank himself. He wanted to meet with Charles and me, claiming he had something important to discuss. I was skeptical, certain it was another one of his schemes, but Charles agreed, wanting to confront his brother face to face. We met Frank at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. He looked different, thinner, with a bitterness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For a moment, he said nothing, just looked at us with a strange intensity. Finally, he spoke. I want it all to stop. Charles and I exchanged a surprised glance, not expecting this. Why now? Charles asked, his tone guarded. You've done everything in your power to destroy us. Why come here now and ask us to stop? Frank looked down, his hands clenched tightly. Because I have nothing left. Oliver's left me. I've lost the little respect I had. And now, I'm facing charges for my attempts to hack into your accounts. I don't have anywhere else to turn. There was silence. I could see the pain in Charles's eyes, the struggle to reconcile the love he once had for his brother with the betrayal Frank had inflicted. After a long pause, Charles sighed, his voice soft yet resolute. Frank, I'll let go of this bitterness, but only if you truly mean it. You need to stop trying to tear us down. Let us live in peace. Frank nodded slowly, his face etched with regret, though I couldn't fully trust the sincerity behind it. He stood up, offering one last glance before he walked away, leaving us in a strange silence. As we watched him go, I felt a sense of closure. For the first time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, we could finally move on from the past. Charles looked at me, a gentle smile on his face. I think it's over, Ben. Truly over. I nodded, a calmness settling over me. We'd faced every challenge, every lie, and come out stronger. And as we left the cafe, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we were ready to face it together, as father and son, finally at peace.